Well, welcome everybody. I'm glad we are doing this over Zoom tonight and not actually in person because it is quite the mess out there on the roads. But hopefully you guys are all warm and safe. And we're going to talk a little bit about bird feeders and specifically feeding birds in the winter. I know there's lots of feeding birds in the summer, but right now we're going to focus on what we have in front of us, which is our winter western birds. So I'm just going to share my screen. And everybody can see that, hopefully. So my name is Kaya. I am the president of Nature Calgary. I do have a degree in environmental science from a very long time ago from UC, and I am an avid birder. And so that's sort of where my sort of knowledge comes from. So it's been a long journey to kind of get to this point, but my mom was the one that introduced me, and my spark bird was actually the Wilson snipe. I listened to it, and it took me a while to figure out what it was because it made this sort of woo noise, as you all know, with its little tail, but I didn't know how to describe it, and they didn't have Merlin bird ID sound yet, so it took me a little bit to ID that. But that's sort of really what got me into learning a little bit about birds and actually developing the research skills to be able to identify birds. So how did feeding birds become a thing? So it started a really long time ago, about the 1880s. There's examples of people putting out bird seed in the Americas and in Britain. But it wasn't actually until the 1980s where it actually sort of took off in North America, especially. And that's because that's when all the hardware stores were out. They had easily accessible bird food. They had easily accessible bird feeders. And that's how it kind of became a thing. And it's sort of a growing industry. There's an estimated $4 billion spent on bird seed in North America. So that kind of gives you an idea of just how much people love their birds and watching them in the winter. Or sorry, not just the winter, so watching them year round and spending money on their birds. About 40% of households actually have some type of bird feeder. So again, that just shows the popularity of all of this. So what I can say is that birding does have some benefits, and that's, watching them from your window. There's lots of different benefits that they have. The first one, of course, is you're supplementally feeding the birds. And I think that's really something you have to keep in mind, is that this is supplemental food. Birds are excellent foragers. They will find food, and they're used to, especially the ones that come to your feeders, are used to ephemeral feeding. And that means there's a seed head, it has a certain number of seeds, and when those seeds run out, they have to find a new food source. So they are designed to go and look for new food sources. So for those of you who are just starting to feed your birds and you put out this feeder and like nobody's come, give it a moment. They'll eventually find it, and you'll be part of their rounds. And so that's something to remember. It is especially beneficial for the birds when there are harsh conditions. So if you have limitations on your finances, which especially in these times, feed them when it's really, really cold outside, or when it's about to be really, really cold outside. You can put that food out at that point in time, because that's really when they're going to be, you're going to find it most beneficial. And that's when they're really going to kind of make sure, or that's when they're really going to find your food helpful. They've done long-term studies where they've had feeders in places like parks and sanctuaries, and they take them away and they actually monitor the health of the birds. And they've actually found that the birds do okay without the feeders in those types of locations. So if your feeder runs out of food, they'll find other food, they'll be fine. So you don't actually have to worry about your birds dying. There is a slightly increased mortality, but nothing drastic. So they are very good at finding food. So one of the really big benefits is actually our benefit is watching the birds through the window. And I'm sure that many of you down have bird feeders for that very reason. You sit there and you sip your morning coffee and watch the birds come in, or you spend the afternoon watching them. And I think that's really kind of critical to understand, is that that's one of the reasons why we do feed birds. It's also quite educational. It can give you a lot of clues about bird behavior, what they're doing, why they're doing it, how they're feeding. So for example, you see the two, or the finches here on this slide. Finches are ones that will actually sit on the feeder. My sister calls them bird pigs, because they just sit on the feeder and they'll just eat all your seed sitting on the feeder. Whereas you'll see other birds like nuthatches or chickadees, they'll come in, grab the seed, go out and feed there. So again, it gives you those behavioral clues, which can then help you when you're going out birding. It also lets you watch them for a lot longer because they're at that feeder. So you can kind of look for those markings. So you can see, especially when you get to the female birds, a lot of times they're brown with stripes or brown with dots. And so having them come to your feeder, you can get a lot closer views of them, and you can kind of get to know them a little bit better that way. And so those are some of the sort of the benefits of bird feeding. There are of course more, but those are some of the highlights. So how do you create a bird banquet? So how do you actually create that feeding frenzy in your yard? So you need two things. My slide's going crazy. So you need the right kind of food and you need the right kind of feeder. So if you have a desire to bring blue jays to your yard, or if you have a desire to bring finches to your yard, it's important to understand what kind of food they like and what kind of feeder they need. And so I'm just going to stop sharing for a moment here, and we're going to look at some feeders. So the first feeder we're going to look at is the simplest feeder of them all. So you can see this is a platform feeder. It looks like a little tiny picnic table, but the food goes here. This is not the most ideal platform feeder because it's a little bit more difficult to clean, but it's one of the easiest ones. You can always just put out a dish. So getting into bird feeding isn't actually that difficult. The second kind of feeder that I'd like to talk about is actually our peanut feeders. They're one of the more popular, peanuts are one of the more popular bird foods. And so peanut feeders happen to be one of the ones that attract birds a lot. So this first one here has these tiny, it's usually made of metal, and then they have tiny little holes. You can see all the little holes here. And so you put actual like unshelled peanuts in here, and that's how the birds, they hang on the side here and they eat that. My favorite kind of peanut feeder, though, is this like slinky-like object. You do have to be careful with these because birds can get their heads caught in here. So do be cautious. You can watch them while they're feeding and then take it down afterwards. But this is always a fun one, especially when the birds are just learning how to use it. They have to learn how to pull the peanuts out, and that has taken has brought me many hours of joy watching them feed and watching the kind of the hierarchy of between the magpies and the blue jays and the other birds all trying to figure out how to feed. Another really popular type of feeder, and another one that's really, really easy and cheap to get into, is our suet feeders. So you can pick these up at the dollar store. They're a couple bucks, and the suet itself is actually a couple bucks. They just open, you put the suet in there, close, and then you have a feeder. And suet is really great for winter, not so great in summer because the fat there can go rancid. So remember that. My favorite kind of suet feeder, though, is this kind. So you put the suet in this top part, and then it has a tail rest. And the birds, especially the woodpeckers, will put their little feet here. Their tail has something to rest on, and then they eat this food. And so this is one of my favorite ones to put out, especially in the winter. There are tube feeders as well. This I've had for eons. They're really simple. They just have these tiny little platforms where the little birds sit and then they eat the food. And this is where you can put all types of different kinds of seed. They're really easy to fill and they're relatively easy to clean. There's this one happens to have little screws in the middle and they just have to undo them. So that's one kind, and that's primarily for things like sunflower or seed mixes. Then there's a second kind. So if you have finches, this is a good one to have. It's a Niger feeder, and as you can see just how tiny these little holes are. And so again, the birds sit on this and then they eat from there. And the last one is a hopper feeder. They usually look like little tiny bird houses, and you fill with seed and the food sort of comes out at the bottom. I happen not to have one, so I don't have an example here, but that's what to look for. So now that we've talked about those feeders, let's talk a little bit about some of the food that you can put out there. So starting with my least favorite kind of food is these. I don't know, I have a big giant box of it, but it's like an all season filled with a whole bunch of stuff. So it's usually filled with things like sorghum and wheat and millet, cracked corn, and then there's just a little bit of peanut, sometimes just a little bit of black sunflower seed. And so that's the least desirable mix for most birds. It is, however, a cheaper blend, and if you have house sparrows, that is your jam. So again, understanding that. The second and my most favorite kind is sunflower seeds. These ones happen to be chips. So if you like no mess, this is your pick. You can also get ones, and I also use them, is just the actual shelled sunflower seeds, and it's fun to watch them try and get inside the sunflowers. But this is if you don't like to have mess around your feeders, this is a good one to have. Peanuts. So because we have the two different kinds of feeders, we have two different kinds of peanuts. So we have the unshelled peanuts and we have shelled peanuts. So if you're using something like a platform feeder, this is a really good one to use because it reduces the amount of mess that you're going to have around your feeder, because the birds usually grab it and fly off with the peanuts. And they last a little longer because they're shelled. But if you got that tube feeder, having them, this one is really good. Now, suet, there's all different kinds of suet, and you can make your own, and it's super cheap to make. You can go into a butcher, ask them for some lard, and melt that down, add some peanut butter, whatever mix-ins you want. So peanuts or those sunflower chips, or even whole sunflower seeds, whatever you have, you can make your own. If you buy one of these once, you can save the little plastic container and just pour the old suet in that, and then we'll give you the same shape to fit into your feeders. However, you don't have that, you can just sort of put them in ice cube trays and just put a bunch of them into the suet feeder. It's a very easy manipulated sort of feeder material. So you can just sort of make it however you need it. Then there's two others I want to talk about. Now, if you are particularly wealthy or want to really treat your birds, the mealworms are probably one of the best things. And so this is a good thing to buy if you want to add that into your suet, or if you want to give your birds a treat every once in a while. The mealworms are really great. If you're like me, I got really lucky and somebody gave me a box full of the beetles. And so now I have a supply of mealworms for a quarter of a potato every couple of weeks. So it's a nice, and some rolled oats. So for me, I'm lucky to have that, but this is a really great treat. And then if you're trying to attract your finches, you want, it's called black thistle, or Niger seed is really what it is. And this is for the finches. So if you don't have finches in your yard, don't waste your money. This is usually quite expensive in terms of seed, but when you have finches, this is what they really love, and even goldfinches. So this is the one you want. If you don't have finches until the summer, don't buy the seed now. Even if it's on sale, the stuff goes bad super quickly. So you want to make sure you buy it just before you need it, so you can actually uh, figure out what this is. All right. See, there's a question in our from Anne. What will ground feeders eat? We'll actually go into that in a little bit. So does anybody have any questions on any of the food or the feeders in particular? Nope. All right. Okay, so I'm going to share my screen again. So the other thing to remember when you are feeding birds is that every bird has a feeding preference or a food preference. So when I say feeding preference, it's not just the food, it's actually where they like to eat. So it's not always, you might have the right kind of food, but if you don't have it in the right feeder, they might be skipping over your feeder for something else. So I know everybody loves the magpies. They really want to bring them to the yard. But out of all the ones that you've feeders and birds that you've seen out of all the feeders and food that I've talked about, which ones do you think are for magpies? Which kinds of food would you put out and which kinds of feeders? Guys can just put your information in the chat. Try and make this a little bit more interactive, or you can unmute yourself for a second and yell out what you think you want or what the birds would want.
I have a friend who feeds them dog kibble. So yep. I'd love your opinion about that.
Dog kibble, as long as it's high quality, is usually okay for the magpies. You have to understand what they're eating in their environment, and they're on garbage duty out in nature, so they're eating rancid meat and whatever garbage they find. So dog kibble might actually be a step up for them. So
okay, thanks.
So we have one person saying they would feed them peanuts. So anybody else have any ideas of what else we might feed magpies or what they might like eating? Guys are a quiet group tonight. I guess you're not used to having bird study group ask you questions. So here's sort of what you would put out. Peanuts, mealworms, cracked corn. You would use a platform feeder. You can use any of the you can use any of the sort of peanut rings. They don't usually go to the tube feeders as much, and then you'll find them on the suet feeders as well. Sometimes the really, especially the really little suet feeders like this one, they have quite a hard time to actually get on there. So it's actually quite fun to watch them do that. So I know not everybody wants to attract magpies to the yard, but the same food that magpies like is the same food that blue jays like. So it's one of those, you got to take one with the other. But what I can say from having fed blue jays for a long time is that blue jays are kind of on a schedule. So if you can figure out, if you start putting out food and you start seeing the blue jays at whatever time it is, pick that same time every day to feed them. And you'll probably still get your magpies, but you'll also get your blue jays. And in my last house, I had the blue jays every morning at 10 a.m. squawking their little head off outside my house saying, "Where's my bird food?" So they can become sort of like, they know their little route and they know their schedule. And if your food is out, then they'll let you know. I'll answer some of these other these other questions kind of close when I get to the other places, but so don't worry about that. So chickadees. So if I wanted to feed a chickadee, what kind of food do I think I would pick, and what kind of feeders would I pick? So in the meeting chat, if you guys want to put in your answers. Got sunflower seeds. It's popular. What kind of feeders would I use? Got some answers for the tube feeders. Yeah. So yeah, I would use sunflower seeds for sure, either the chips or the whole seeds. And I would use peanuts. I know it shows shelled peanuts there, but I'd actually use, they'll go to the tube peanut feeders, and they love mealworms as well. The hopper type feeders, so those are like the birdhouse type feeders, the platform feeders, tube feeders, and suet feeders. Those are all ones that you'll get chickadees too. Chickadees hate millet. They hate cracked corn. Don't waste your money. Don't buy that mixed seed. They won't eat it. They're going to cause a bigger mess, especially if you have a platform feeder, or if it's in a tube feeder, they'll literally just pick it out, throw it on the ground. So somebody was asking about how to like get rid of mice. Higher quality bird food. So sticking to the things like sunflower seeds or sunflower chips rather than the millet and the cracked corn will really reduce the amount of waste, and then will reduce the number of rodents that you get visiting your feeder. So if you get chickadees, you will also get nuthatches, and they like pretty much the same stuff as chickadees. So they'll feed together. You'll sometimes see them fighting for dominance, especially on the tube feeders. And then as soon as you get the finches involved, they really hog the feeders from some of the chickadees and nuthatches. But it's the nuthatches and the chickadees like the same kinds of food. All right. House sparrows. So I know a lot of people have house sparrows near their homes, especially if you have things like cotoneaster bushes or really dense hedges. Oftentimes you have your house sparrow coming in to visit. So if you want to feed them, what kind of food do you feed them? And what feeders? Anybody have any guesses? Yeah, platform feeders.
My experience is they'll eat anything I put out.
Yeah. You are right, and they will eat almost anything. They love millet. They love cracked corn. They love mealworms. They love sunflower seeds. They'll even eat peanuts if you stick them out there. They'll eat from hoppers, platforms, tubes, suet feeders, pretty much anything. So how do you get rid of them? How do you not have them come to all your feeders? The way to do that is actually to start using more high quality, so more sunflower seeds, so using less millet and cracked corn. Veer away from things like platforms because they really do like to sit on platforms. Go more for the tube type feeders and bring them away from tiny bushes. And I know that sometimes can cause issues with some other predation for some of your other birds, but the house sparrows really like dense bushes, and they like to retreat into those dense bushes. And so if you have dense bushes near your house, that's really what's attracting them. So trying to move the feeders away from those areas, trying to keep the feeders somewhere where they're a little bit more exposed, because house sparrows don't really like being exposed. So that's my tip there. Will you always get rid of them? No. And will they come into open areas? Yes. But the farther away you are from bushes or shelter, the more likely you are to not have house sparrows. All right, house finches. So not everybody is lucky enough to have house finches in their neighborhood. We had some for a few years, but they've disappeared over the last few years. I don't know where they are. But if you're lucky enough to have them, what can you feed them? And in what feeders? Anybody have guesses?
They seem to like it. Just in my experience, they seem to really like sunflowers, like the shelled ones.
Yep. And you'll see them sitting on the feeders, using their beaks to crack open those sunflowers and then eat the seed inside. So they're actually one of the ones, like my sister said, house pigs. They'll actually sit on that feeder and crack open the shells and eat them and then go for the next one. And so it's a fun one to watch. So this is the one where if you have them, Niger seeds are great. The sunflower seeds, and of course mealworms. Most birds like that. They'll eat at platforms, they'll eat at hoppers, and they'll eat at tube feeders. They don't tend to like the suet feeders as much. They're more of a seed eating type of bird, so they tend to eat eat seeds more often. So that's what you can do. And one of the most common ones to come to your feeder is actually our woodpeckers. And so this happens to be a downy, but you can get Harry's, even pileateds, flickers, all of those. Which ones do you think they like the most?
They seem to really like the suet. And yesterday I had a flicker that was actually lying on the platform feeder, eating sunflowers. Like he was just literally lying there, just wolfing them down.
Yeah.
So
Yeah, and you'll see that lying down behavior because that's the way that their little feet are organized. So their feet are really close to their body. And so they'll be like really horizontal when they're on those platform feeders. But when they're on other feeders, they'll be really, really upright. So you're right, Anne. And Sandra said suet. Yeah, it's one of the big ones, but they'll also go after peanuts. So especially in those big metal tube feeders, you'll see them hooking onto that and tipping away at the peanuts. They'll eat sunflower chips as well. Not from tube feeders with the with little tiny platforms, but if they're on a actual platform feeder. And of course, they'll eat mealworms as well, especially if it's smushed into suet. You'll also even see them on those rings of ring feeders. You'll see them pecking away at the peanuts in there, trying to get the peanut seeds inside. And I finally included one. Not everybody has this in their neighborhood, but we have Junkos in the city, dark-eyed Junkos in the city. And if you happen to live in a neighborhood that you have dark-eyed Junkos in, they're always a fun one to have. However, this is one of the things to remember is they are ground feeders. And so this is one of the ones where they like the millet and the corn that everybody else drops. So this is one of the things to remember, but they will eat at platforms. So if you do have a platform feeder, or my in-laws actually have a kind of a mesh thing that catches all the fallen seeds, they'll go on there and feed off of there. But they like to be sort of on flat-ish surface. They won't go on to the feeders themselves if they're not flat. So yeah. So now that you know some of the foods and the feeders and what birds you can attract with each of those, what are some of the risks of feeding birds? Because there are some. And this is my brother-in-law took this picture, and you can see this bird has some crud around its eye. This is a house finch, and it has conjunctivitis. And this is one of the diseases that they get. And this is why it's really, really critical to clean your feeders. A lot of people think, no big deal, not a problem. You know, I'm putting in clean bird seed every time. But it's actually the birds themselves passing the diseases. And this has spread from the East Coast and it's now on the West Coast. And so it's spread all the way across North America. And it's like pink eye in humans, but where we can put, you know, medicine and cold compresses or warm compresses on our eyes, these guys just eventually can't see, then they can't feed, and then they get picked off. So if you happen to notice a bird with that, one, try and capture it and get it into rehab because they are rehabilitatable, or they can clear up with the right supportive care. But two, take down your feeders immediately. So if you notice any dead birds around your feeders, do that first. Just take down those bird feeders. The other one that's really prevalent, and it happened, there was an outbreak of it a couple years ago in Vancouver with salmonella, and that was with pine siskins. And my mother-in-law had a pine siskin drop dead right in front of her off of a feeder. So she took down her feeders right away and didn't put them back out until they said everything was, the outbreak had sort of cleared up. Because these feeders, you have to remember, attract a whole bunch of birds together, and that's really what's helping to spread the disease faster. So by having them forage more individually, they're less likely to pass the disease from one to the other. So Alan, how often should you clean your feeder? You should clean it every single time you sort of put your seed in, if you fill it up to the top. If you put new seed in every day because you're kind of monitoring how much seed you're putting in, I would clean it every week or 2 weeks, depending on how many birds visit your feeder. So some people have like dozens of birds around their feeder all day. I would clean those more regularly, every couple days. If you only have a few birds that visit you every once in a while, you can go a week or 2 without cleaning. But make sure anytime you refill that whole tube, you clean the whole feeder. And it needs to be cleaned with a 10% bleach solution. And that bleach solution has to sit on the surface of your feeder for at least 5 minutes. I know people are like, I don't want to use bleach on my nice feeder. I've used bleach on my feeders all the time. They're fine. They'll be fine. I can always buy a new feeder, but I don't want to pass a disease on to a bird because that sort of defeats the purpose. So another guest threat is predation. So cats are a really big issue. So if you have a neighborhood cat who likes to visit, make sure your feeders are in places where, one, the birds can actually escape into bushes or away, or that it's somewhere where the cat can't climb up, or you clean the bird seed around often, or you have something underneath your bird feeder to clean up all the seeds so that the birds aren't tempted to go in the ground where a cat can get it. You can also always ask your neighbor to please put, there's some really great cat, they look like clown collars. They're bright colors, and it's actually been shown to stop the cats from feeding on birds or predating birds, because the birds can see the color around the cat's face. When you put a bell on a cat, it just learns how to be better at being quiet. So you're literally training an assassin. It's sort of where like how pickpockets train. They're not going to try and get that bell. That's what cats do. They just learn how to make the bell not sound, and it makes them better predators. Whereas this big collar actually stops the cats from being able to get the birds, because the birds can notice that colorful color. So. And then finally, if you are going to have actually, there's 2 more things. If you are going to have birds, you're going to get a predator. So this happens to be a merlin, and as you can see, the feathers flying off. This was probably an unlucky chickadee, or perhaps a woodpecker, and it got taken out. So you'll get especially in the winter, you'll get merlins and sharpshin hawks in the neighborhood, and they'll take out your birds. And in the summer, you'll get, or goshawks now, you'll also get Cooper's hawks in the spring and summer, and that's their food source. You might even get saw-whet owls or great horned owls taking out some of your birds as well. So depending on where you live. So that's something to remember. And the final one is bird strikes. So this on windows. So this happened to be downtown. But if you are putting up bird feeders, you have to, if you see a lot of window strikes, or you're getting a lot of window strikes, you need to start thinking about the correct placement. So this happens to be one that you stick on the window, and you might think that sticking a bird feeder on a window might actually increase the number of bird strikes on that window, but actually it's a reduction, because one of the reasons why birds hit and die or get concussions is because they're going at speed. So if they're right and are startled, but if they're right at the window, they don't have enough speed to hit the window with enough force to kill them. So that's something. Can everybody see my screen, or am I?
You can see it.
Okay.
Yep, I can see it.
Just Irene's having a problem, so
Oh,
I'll stop sharing and try and reshare. Hopefully that works. So this happens to be a red crossbill, and this happens to be somebody who had one of those bird cameras on their window. So that's something that you can get. The other place to put them, if you are getting a lot of window strikes, is to put them far away from your house. So put a post up and put them far away from your windows, at least 15 feet. So you can either have it within 2 feet of your window, or you can have it 15 feet away. It's that in between part that if birds are startled and they see a reflection of a tree in your window, that's when they actually get hurt. But at 15 feet, they're far enough away usually that they'll go somewhere else, not into your window. So, yeah. So the other thing to remember is to set a budget. So as you can see here, these are especially house sparrows. They'll eat you out of house and home. They'll eat and birds cache food. So these ones happen to be just eating the food, but a lot of birds like chickadees, nuthatches, will take that food, go and hide it in a tree, come back, take some more food, go hide it in a tree, come back. And so all of a sudden your feeder is like empty, and it's Monday. So you can either set a budget of how much food you want to put out a day, or just how much you want to spend in a month. If you run out of seed, that's fine. Then next month you have your budget again, put the seed out, they'll come back. So those are the two ways of dealing with it. So if you're not always at your window watching the birds, don't put your seed out at that point in time. Put out your seed when you're able to watch them. They'll come, they'll find you, especially if you know if they have a schedule. And of course, when you put out bird feeders, you will get other friends. And so I've woken up in the morning and like the whole feeder was like empty, and I was like, what happened? And then I put more seed out, and then the next day it happened again, and then I finally looked underneath, and there's, yes, like all of the deer had been visiting, and they'd been knocking the feeder and getting all the food out of the feeder. So this is when you can either take your seed in at night so that your deer, if they're night visitors, won't eat it, or you can get more sturdy platforms, or I actually had a platform feeder disappear from my yard. I think a deer took it because I can't find it anywhere. It's gone. So they can be quite persistent. So yeah, just be aware of that. And of course, squirrels. And so how do we deter squirrels? Stop using platform feeders because that's gonna like squirrels will be able to climb up. If you are gonna use a platform feeder, use a really thin pole, put a big baffle on it so that they can't climb up, and put the platform above that. That's one thing to do. I know that when I had my peanut rings out, I would get squirrels. So you can also hang those out farther, have the squirrels have to like drop or figure it out a little bit more. Eventually they either figure it out or they get discouraged and they won't come back. So baffles or hanging things out much farther away, like right at the ends of the branches or away from other things. So you can also get those shepherd's crooks. Those will also work to deter things like squirrels, but not the deer. The deer, you can put it up higher. That will also deter the deer. So
With the squirrels, I just want to say, I've given up. If you can't beat them, join them.
yeah,
So I just let them have at it. And actually, I have one squirrel, and I know it's the same animal because she has gold. I think it's a female, and she has yellow tufts on her ears. And so and she hangs off the tube feeders, and
yep.
she can, she's pretty clever. So I've just sort of given up. Let them
And
have.
you'll find that they won't eat all of the seed. Eventually they get tired and they'll go
Yeah.
off. And if you're finding that again, the squirrels are coming out a lot, you can give them a more desirable like platform feed, and you can put a tube feeder somewhere else for the birds because they're going to go after the easy food rather than having to go through a rigmarole of harder food. So again, that's something to
Yeah,
remember.
that's a good suggestion. Thanks.
Yeah, but it's going to happen, and it's annoying, but that's one of the things. I just sort of embrace the wildlife, and see what you have in your yard. So I am open to questions. I didn't include a slide about the one more important thing to talk about, and that's being a feeder watcher. So I'm going to stop sharing right now, but you can become a feeder watcher for a Christmas bird count. There is a circle that you have to be in. I am like literally 50 meters away from the circle edge. So I am not able to count birds, but if you're within that circle, we're looking for people to be Christmas bird count feeders. I will put the information in the chat below. And you can also become a feeder watcher for Birds Canada. And they actually, originally, when they first started the feeder watcher program, there was very few papers or studies on bird feeding. And since the introduction of Feeder Watcher, there are now hundreds of papers on feeding birds and the what impact that is, or what birds are coming into yards, things like that. So it's really I guess important to if you're going to have a feeder, it's a nice way of giving back to the community to sort of share your results. You don't have to do it a lot. You can pick a certain time, and they just ask you, I think, for a 15-minute block on a consistent, like Monday, Wednesday, Friday, or a Tuesday, Thursday, or whatever, and so that that way they can count on your data. So that's it.
There's a couple of suggestions in the chat around squirrels. Irene mentioned that Amy Tan has a suggestion regarding squirrels in her book, The Backyard Bird Chronicles. And then there's a comment that squirrel buster feeders work like a charm.
Yeah. Yeah, that's the other one is you can actually get bird feeders that when there's enough pressure, the little openings close. And so a chickadee, not heavy enough, squirrel, it's going to close on them. It does take away the opportunity for some of our bigger birds to feed, but it does reduce the squirrel. So if you have a really big squirrel problem in your backyard, it is worth the $50 or $60 the feeders are because over the year you're going to get that back in the amount of like seed that you're not buying because you're feeding the squirrels. So that's another option for you.
I'm just wondering if you can say anything about, excuse me, dominance. that you see with the birds. I watched the other day, I couldn't believe it. There was a pair of red-breasted nuthatches that were defending the platform feeder against magpies.
Yep.
To the point where the magpies were lining up along the fence waiting for their turn, and every time they would come, these nuthatches would chase them away. It was amazing to see these little birds actually pushing back at the magpies. But is there something more that you can say about the dominance that you can see on the feeder?
Yeah, they've actually done studies on that, and that's one of the feeder watcher studies is they've actually looked at the dominance hierarchies within not only bird species but actual birds themselves. So not only in a species is there dominance between species. It's usually not nuthatches like driving away the
Yeah, I was really
magpies. It's
surprised.
usually magpies driving away things like blue jays, and blue jays driving away things like nuthatches and chickadees. Or then the nuthatches will sort of drive away the chickadees. The finches will dominate a tube feeder because they sit on those feeders. So there is a dominance, and that's one of the fun things to watch and find out, is to figure out who's king in your yard, who rules the feeders in your yard. And so that's one of the cool things. I know we had a platform feeder, or you can even just on the edge of your deck, you can put out peanuts, and you can actually watch the birds, the blue jays and the magpies. They'll come, they'll pick one up, put it down, hop over, pick another one up, put it down. And so they'll actually weigh those peanuts to see which one they want, if they're the dominant bird. If they're not the dominant bird, they come in, they grab whatever they can, and they get right out of there. So it's fun to watch that happening. And so that's kind of cool. So yeah. And then, just to watch the different varieties of birds that you can get, especially in the winter, you can get some fun migrants that are coming through. Sorry, in the fall, you can get some fun migrants that are coming through. And then sometimes you get birds that stick in places longer, and they're actually finding that they're getting more and more northern reaches of birds, and they think that might be because of the supplemental feeding, because one of the reasons birds migrate is not temperature, it's food source. So, the reason we don't have hummingbirds here is not necessarily because they can't survive in the winter, although it gets kind of cold, but a lot of times it's the food, because they can eat their body weight in sugar water, and they need about 2,000 bugs, and they don't really have that in this area. So if they had those types of foods, they might be able to survive in more northern climates. But you're starting to see things push north for sure.
There was a question earlier, so I'm just going to go back to it, about whether you had an opinion about suet that's made in China.
Yeah, it's always a question of where to buy and what to buy. And that's one thing. It's why I kind of like making my own suet, because it's, one, super easy, and two, you can put whatever you want in it. But at the same time, I would say pick the highest quality ingredients that you can afford, and enjoy the birds. So while I would say I would like you to buy higher quality suet, it's not necessarily always, not everybody's able to do that. And I would rather somebody put out that suet and learn more about birds and want to protect them than actually not have that. So I would say that's one thing. Yeah. And there's one thing I did forget to mention. Sorry, I have a foster dog, and he got super sick today, and I was finishing up the presentation, and I had to take him to the hospital to get his stomach pumped because he ate an entire pound of grapes, which are toxic to dogs. So that was fun today. But the other thing is, please do not feed birds in the parks. Don't take the bird feeders into the parks and fill them up and take care of them, or put up little tins and feed them in the parks. Please don't do that. They have a job in the parks. They need to spread the seed. They need to do that. And you can't clean the feeders when they're in the parks, and that's when they're going to be spreading the diseases. They're going to do fine in the parks all by themselves. So don't worry about that. Feed them in your backyard where there's not the seeds, there's not the shelter, there's not the that kind of thing. So stick that, keep that feeding in, I guess, in home. Yeah.
That's great, Kaya. Lots of comments about good job, and everybody learned a lot. So that's great. Thank you very much for being willing to share that information with us. I think, people tend to assume that others know about some of these things, and that's not necessarily the case. So I think it's great to have an opportunity to kind of go back to what are the basics and what kind of food. One of the things that I've noticed, I wanted to ask you again about the ground feeders, because I have partridges that come in. What I notice is they eat whatever the other birds kick out of the feeders. They seem to be like, especially around the Niger seed. I think that's what they're eating. That's what it looks like they're eating, and bits of sunflower seeds. But are there things that are more specific to the kinds of things they would feed on?
Well, I mean, they'll be eating things like wheat or corn, because you'll often find them right near those bins in the like in the prairies. So that's one thing to look for is you can put out stuff like that. Again, I would put it on a platform or something just a little bit raised, so that way you're not always on the ground, and because otherwise you will get mice if you are deliberately spreading seed all over. But if you raise it up a little bit, you can clean up the mess a little bit more. So yeah.
Thank you. That's really helpful. There was a comment about any worries about mice, and I think you sort of answered that.
Yeah, so if you do see mice and you don't want them, stop feeding, move your feeders, buy something that will go right under them. Under the feeders, use higher quality seed that doesn't have any mess. So stop using millet and sorghum and wheat. Birds, ground feeders like that, but the chickadees and nuthatches don't. So
that's great. And just to call everybody's attention to the fact that Kaya put a link in the chat. So, certainly take advantage of that if you can. And
yeah, so the first link is if you're in the bird circle, and then the second link is if you want to sign up to be a feeder watcher for December 15th, which is the Christmas bird count.
well, that's great, Kaya. Thank you so much. Really useful information. And it looks like everybody really enjoyed your comments. So thanks again for all of that. And I just want to wish everybody all the best for the holiday season.